Interpretation or interpreting is the facilitating of oral or sign language communication, either simultaneously or consecutively, between users of different languages. Translation studies is the systematic study of the theory, description and application of interpretation and translation. An interpreter is a person who converts a thought or expression in a source language into an expression with a comparable meaning in a target language, either simultaneously in real time, or consecutively when the speaker pauses after completing one or two sentences. The interpreter's function is to convey every semantic element as well as tone and register, and every intention and feeling of the message that the source language speaker is directing to target language recipients for written speeches and lectures. Sometimes the reading of pre-translated texts is used. Comparison to translation. Despite being used in a non-technical sense as interchangeable, interpreting and translation are not synonymous. Interpreting takes a message from a source language and renders that message into a different target language. In interpreting, the interpreter will take in a complex concept from one language, choose the most appropriate vocabulary in the target language to faithfully render the message in a linguistically, emotionally, tonally, and culturally equivalent message. Translation is the transference of meaning from text to text, with the translator having time and access to resources to produce an accurate document or verbal artifact. Lesser known is transliteration, used within sign language interpreting. Takes one form of a language and transfer those same words into another form. In court interpreting, it is not acceptable to omit anything from the source, no matter how quickly the source speaks, since not only is accuracy a principal canon for interpreters, but mandatory. The inaccurate interpretation of even a single word in immaterial can totally mislead the triers of fact. The most important factor for this level of accuracy is the use of a team of 2 or more interpreters during a lengthy process, with one actively interpreting and the second monitoring for greater accuracy. Although there are many different opinions in the industry on how to deliver the most accuracy in stressful situations, translators have time to consider and revise each word and sentence before delivering their product to the client, while live interpretation's goal is to achieve total accuracy at all times. Details of the original speech can be missed and interpreters can ask for clarification from the speaker. In any language, including sign languages, when a word is used for which there is no exact match, expansion may be necessary in order to fully interpret the intended meaning of the word. Another unique situation is when an interpreted message appears much shorter or longer than the original message. The message may appear shorter at times because of unique efficiencies within a certain language. English to Spanish is a prime example. Spanish uses gender-specific nouns, not used in English, which convey information in a more condensed package, thus requiring more words and time in an English interpretation to provide the same plethora of information. Because of situations like these, interpreting often requires a lag, or processing time. This time allows the interpreter to take in subjects and verbs in order to rearrange grammar appropriately while picking accurate vocabulary before starting the message. While working with interpreters, it is important to remember lag time in order to avoid accidentally interrupting one another and to receive the entire message. Modes. Simultaneous. In simultaneous interpretation, the interpreter renders the message in the target language as quickly as he or she can formulate it from the source language, while the source language speaker continuously speaks. The most common form is extempore SI, where the interpreter does not know the message until he or she hears it. SI is the common mode used by sign language interpreters. In the ideal setting for oral language, the interpreter sits in a soundproof booth and speaks into a microphone, while clearly seeing and hearing the source language speaker via earphones. The simultaneous interpretation is rendered to the target language listeners via their earphones. The first introduction and employment of extempore simultaneous interpretation using electronic equipment that can facilitate large numbers of listeners was the Nuremberg trials, with 4 official working languages. Consecutive and consecutive interpreting. The interpreter speaks after the source language speaker completes 1 or 2 complete sentences. The speech is divided into segments, and the interpreter sits or stands beside the source language speaker, listening and taking notes as the speaker progresses through the message. When the speaker pauses or finishes speaking, the interpreter then renders a portion of the message or the entire message in the target language. Consecutive interpretation is rendered as short CI or long CI. In short CI, the interpreter relies on memory, each message segment being brief enough to memorize. In long CI, the interpreter takes notes of the message to aid rendering long passages. These informal divisions are established with the client before the interpretation is effected, depending upon the subject, its complexity, and the purpose of the interpretation. On occasion, document site translation is required of the interpreter during consecutive interpretation work. Site translation combines interpretation and translation. The interpreter must render the source language document to the target language as if it was written in the target language. Site translation occurs usually, but not exclusively, in judicial and medical work. Consecutively interpreted speeches, or segments of them, tend to be short. 50 years ago, the CI interpreter would render speeches of 20 or 30 minutes. Today, 10 or 15 minutes is considered too long, particularly since audiences usually prefer not to sit through 20 minutes of speech they cannot understand. Often, if not previously advised, the source language speaker is unaware that they may speak more than a single sentence before the CI interpretation is rendered and might stop after each sentence to await its target language rendering. Sometimes, however, depending upon the setting or subject matter, and upon the interpreter's capacity to memorize, the interpreter may ask the speaker to pause after each sentence or after each clause. Sentence-by-sentence interpreting requires less memorization and therefore lower likelihood for omissions. Yet its disadvantage is in the interpreters not having heard the entire speech or its gist, and the overall message is sometimes harder to render both because of lack of context and because of interrupting delivery. This method is often used in rendering speeches, depositions, recorded statements, court witness testimony, and medical and job interviews. But it is usually best to complete a whole idea before it is interpreted. Full consecutive interpreting of whole thoughts allows for the full meaning of the source language message to be understood before the interpreter renders it in the target language. This affords a truer, more accurate, and more accessible interpretation than does simultaneous interpretation. The only case in which the technique of consecutive interpretation cannot be applied is when a written speech is being read out. Written speeches are best dealt with by the reading of pre-translated texts. Whispered interpreting, sometimes called whispering simultaneous. The interpreter sits or stands next to the person or people requiring interpretation. The interpreter does not whisper, as this would after a time be taxing on the voice, making further speech impossible due to the hoarseness whispering for long periods induces. Instead, the interpreter speaks softly using normal speech kept at a low volume. The interpreter's mouth and the ear of the person listening must be in close proximity so as not to disturb the others in the room. Without electronic equipment, chuckotage is tiring as the interpreter's posture is affected. Simultaneous interpreting is used when people need to follow what is said in the room without themselves making a contribution, whereas consecutive interpretation is used when there is a dialogue, and perhaps people wish to hear what the original speaker said in the source language because some of the listeners speak that language, or in a court setting, to preserve for the record the original words of the speaker when a witness or other party is questioned. Consecutive interpretation will double the time taken, as everything said in source language is repeated once again in the target language. Because of the intense concentration needed by interpreters to hear every word spoken and provide an accurate rendition in the target language, professional interpreters work in pairs or in teams of 3, so that the interpreters can switch and rest after interpreting for about 10 to 20 minutes. Relay interpreting is usually used when there are several target languages. A source language interpreter interprets the text to a language common to every interpreter, who then render the message to their respective target languages. For example, a Japanese source message first is rendered to English to a group of interpreters, who listen to the English and render the message into Arabic, French, and Russian, the other target languages. In heavily multilingual meetings, there may be more than one intermediate language, i.e., a Greek source language could be interpreted into English and then from English to other languages, and, at the same time, it may also be directly interpreted into French, and from French into yet more languages. This solution is most often used in the multilingual meetings of the EU institutions. Liaison interpreting involves relaying what is spoken to one, between two, or among many people. This can be done after a short speech, or consecutively, sentence by sentence, or as chuchottage, aside from notes taken at the time. No equipment is used.